Hi, I'm Alice Wong. I'm a first-year MPP, and on behalf of the Asian, Black, and Hispanic Caucus, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. We're also hosting an informal reception in the IOP after this, and we'd like you all to attend. We believe that tonight's event has an important public policy implication. So join us and welcome our moderator tonight, who is the executive editor of the national publication Education Week and is currently serving as a Neiman Fellow, Martha Matsky.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the forum. It's my pleasure to be serving as moderator for this distinguished group of panelists who are coming to Harvard tonight from all points of the compass to debate for you, for all of us, one of the most important emerging issues in domestic policy in this country. As you know, California recently passed a U.S. English language resolution. Illinois has also in the last year become the first state to pass an English-only law, and there are moves afoot in a growing number of states to enact similar legislation. In my field, the field of education, the question of pedagogy and language has rapidly become, in the last 5 or 8 years, one of the most important issues for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of students across the country, and it will continue to be so. It's my pleasure now to start the discussion, and to do so I'd like to introduce the panelists who are on the dais with me. On my far right is Charles Pappas, a Boston lawyer who has done work with immigration issues and is currently serving as a member of the Board of Legal Advisors for U.S. English, the organization that has taken the leadership role in advocating an English-only America. On my middle left is Mario Moreno, a lawyer with the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, who will discuss arguments against English-only policies. Welcome to Mr. Moreno. On my near right is Arnold Torres, a consultant who has had long experience working in Hispanic affairs. He has served as congressional liaison and executive director for the League of United Latin American Citizens and is currently involved in a University of California study of the English language concerns since the 1700s. Monty Manabog, on my near left, began his political career in 1976 when he was elected to the City Council for Monterey Park, an ethnically diverse city near Los Angeles. He is currently serving his third term as mayor of Monterey Park, a city which has acquired fame for its implementation and repeal, subsequently, of an English-only ordinance. He will bring us a first-hand perspective of the local politics and situation of the English-only movement. John Loring, on my far left, is a Massachusetts state legislator who serves on the Ways and Means Committee and chaired the subcommittee to study and implement Proposition 2.5, the tax limitation measure that Massachusetts passed in, was it 1981, John? He is one of several state representatives to have introduced English-only legislation on the state level in Massachusetts. I'd like to begin our discussion, if we may, with Charles Pappas. Each speaker will speak for approximately 8 minutes, and then we will go to questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I think I'd initially like to take issue with your characterization of an English-only America. From my perspective, I believe that support of or passage of an English language amendment does not suggest an English-only America. It's simply a pro-English movement dedicated to preserving the historic place of English in our national culture. I don't come from an English-only world. I come from a bilingual household. I managed to go to Mexico and attempt to learn Spanish, and I lived with a Mexican family for almost 3 months. Had some success, as a matter of fact. So I do not see a one-dimensional, monolingual world developing from this amendment. For centuries, immigrants, including my grandparents, have arrived in the United States speaking a myriad of languages. In my case, I was raised in a Greek-speaking household. I believe the governor may have also been able to say the same thing. And our society has allowed these immigrants to preserve their cultural differences, and I claim that I've been able to do that, while learning a common language which allows people like myself to assimilate into the American mainstream. And with this one language, I think we have learned to respect other people and their cultures with a sympathy and an understanding. My opinion is that our history has shown that we can overcome our differences as long as we share a common language, and the English Language Amendment would simply establish English as our official language. The first legislation, to give you a historic view, was introduced in 1981 by Senator Hayakawa, who no doubt also came from a bilingual background. And in every other Congress, it has been subsequently reintroduced and presently has over 88 co-sponsors. In the 100th Congress, there's an English language amendment pending in both houses, introduced by Senator Sims and by Congressman Shumway. And the text of the bill is fairly simple. It reads, Section 1, the English language shall be the official language of the United States. And Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, the English Language Amendment establishes simply a broad principle that English is the official language of the United States is entitled to legal recognition and protection as such, and that no other language would enjoy similar status. The English Language Amendment gives legal recognition to what I have to believe has long been a political and social reality. That's the way I was raised. I believe we're all speaking in English here. The degrees are granted in English. The laws of the legislature are published in English. The proceedings of the courts take place in English. As some people have said, it is a de facto reality, and this amendment would not do much more than make it a de jure reality. It should be pointed out that nothing in the amendment prohibits the use of languages other than English in unofficial situations, such as in family communications, religious ceremonies, or private business. If you're a retailer and you think you can make more money by putting your advertisements in another language, please do it. Nothing in the amendment forbids the teaching of foreign languages. It certainly would be my hope that most people become, in some measure, bilingual. The reason I went to Mexico to study Spanish was I thought it was the language of the hemisphere in addition to English. So I don't feel as though it suggests that we would be an English-only nation. Nothing in this amendment removes or abridges any person's constitutional rights. I see it simply as a benign statement not intended to keep people out, but on the contrary, it's an invitation for all Americans to be part of this society which does function in the English language. It prescribes the language of government, does not prescribe the language of individual persons, and it's largely a symbolic pronouncement meant to guide the Congress and the courts. It charges government with the protection of our common language, but I believe it's flexible enough to allow the legislative process to determine how and where it should be implemented. Anytime you pass a law, of course, there will be ultimate litigation. There will be unanswered questions. When the ERA was proposed, a lot of people criticized it because it might have raised this issue. It might have caused this controversy. It seems to me not a reason to propose an amendment or a piece of legislation. In a general sense, the English Language Amendment is intended to do essentially four things. That is, to establish English as the official language of the federal, state, and local governments, to bring official recognition to the principle that a common language is necessary to preserve the basic internal unity required for political stability and national cohesion. My own impression is if we have legislative gridlock now, to add a language dimension would only make it somehow more severe. Also, it would prevent government, I'm sure this would be a controversial issue, from mandating multilingual postings or publications, except where public health, safety, or justice require the use of another language, and it would lastly reaffirm the importance of English in our national life. Now, Throughout the United States, there have been various legislative efforts, and at least 9 states have now made English their official language. Indiana, Illinois, Nebraska, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, most famously, I suspect, California in Proposition 63. And 30 other states are considering similar proposals this year. I guess we could say that's even the case here in Massachusetts, because pending in the state legislature, both House and Senate, is some English language legislation, which on the House side was introduced by Representative Loring. So it's my opinion that it is clear if you wish to function or participate in our society, you must know English. It's the language of opportunity and of our national government. And from my perspective, the ultimate issue is, if not English, then what alternative? I do not believe there is a viable alternative to the English language. And I think we should learn from the experience of countries such as Belgium or Canada or India, and avoid the divisions and turmoil that language conflicts can bring to a country. And I believe the English language amendment is an attempt to prevent such a conflict in the future. I will now defer to the other speakers, and I look forward to taking your questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Pappas. Now, Mario Moreno, Assistant Counsel, Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund. Mr. Moreno.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here with you. I spent a year of my life here at 78-79 as a John L. Loeb Fellow at the Graduate School of Urban Design, and it's always nice to be at Harvard. Let me state from the onset that English is a language of political, social, and economic discourse in the United States. And without proficiency in English, it's almost impossible to get ahead in this country. And Latinos know that as better than almost anyone else. Indeed, 98% of Hispanic parents recently surveyed in Miami indicate that it is essential that their children read and write English perfectly. Only 94% of non-Hispanic parents felt the same way. In California, there are waiting lines to take English classes of 40,000. There's 27,000 in New York, and this was as a report in the New York Times back in October of last year. So knowing English, and only English, is simply not enough. And to suggest so, as some do in the English-only movement, only provides a 19th century answer to an American entering the 21st century. I say the 19th century for many reasons. The 19th century was, after all, the age of Jim Crow, the literacy test for blacks. The purpose was to keep them from voting and exercising constitutional rights that they had won in post-war South. Today, the U.S. English criticizes bilingual provisions of the Voting Rights Act. These provisions are based on discriminatory usage of literacy tests and a history of educational and intellectual discrimination against Hispanics, Asian Americans, and American Indians. The 19th century also brought us the first English literacy requirements for admission into the United States. This restriction on immigration was aimed at the Eastern and Southern Europeans. Today, immigration restrictions are aimed at Hispanics. Also in the 19th century, Asians in California were not allowed to testify in courts because they were not white. It was also at the turn of the century that the Americanization, Anglo-conformity movement was in full swing, targeting mainly German Americans, particularly after World War I in the Middle West. Excuse me. So the debate over language in the United States is not new, and it's not novel to the 1980s. It is somewhat like Halley's Comet. It comes around every 70 years. And there's a lot of heat, a lot of dust, and a lot of dirt associated with it. You hear a lot about it, but only a few actually see it. 65 years ago, the Supreme Court heard a number of cases from the Midwestern states which had made English their official language or had barred the teaching of German in lower classes. Much like today's English Language Amendment, Section 1 of the Nebraska Act of 1921 stated, the English language is hereby declared to be the official language of this state, and all official proceedings, records, and publications shall be in such language. Nebraska courts upheld it. But the U.S. Supreme Court enjoined Nebraska officials from enforcing the act in Nebraska District versus McLevy. On the same day, the court also struck Iowa and Ohio statutes which barred the teaching of German in elementary schools. And Justice McReynolds was very eloquent about this issue, and I quote, "The protection of the Constitution extends to all, to those who speak other languages as well as those who are born with English on their tongue. As then, monolinguists were able to win a few battles in states, but nonetheless the movement and the basis for the movement was reprehensible to the Constitution. In short, the English-only doctrine, be it English language amendment in in Congress or Proposition 63, as in California, contradicts the constitutional guarantees embodied in the First, Sixth, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The First Amendment safeguards the right to petition the government for the redress of grievances. If enforced, the English-only amendment would interfere with, if not bar, access to governmental activities, elections, education, for those Americans not fully proficient in English. The Sixth Amendment requires a defendant to have an opportunity to know the charges and confront the witnesses against him. The Second Circuit, as well as the Federal Court Interpreters Act of 1978, now recognize the necessity for court interpreters in non-English speaking defendants. Finally, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments have all been cited in cases ending English-only election procedures, even prior to the 1975 Voting Rights Act. Without these constitutional protections, making English the constitutional language would be the forerunner to the return of English literacy tests for all Americans in order to vote. So what does this all mean today? The English language amendment is a completely negative approach. It won't help anyone become more proficient in English. Only more English classes, be it bilingual education for the youngsters or English education for adults, will increase overall proficiency in English. And these are all things, sadly, that U.S. English and its forerunner, the San Francisco Committee for Ballots in English, have opposed. When Greta Bacalus of U.S. English testified last year before the Senate Appropriations Committee, she urged cuts of 28 to 50% in funding of bilingual education. She also sought to eliminate teacher training grants. While U.S. English and Congressman Shumway, the House author of the English-only amendment, sought educational appropriations cuts, students were being underrepresented, or underserved, Mounting evidence indicates that bilingual education is a superior method of bringing students into the mainstream of American life. Students go further, faster, when the teachers build upon what the student already knows and utilizes the native language to teach English and other subjects. The latest evidence from the Department of Education is that students in bilingual education programs outperform students in immersion and ESL, English as a Second Language type programs, in math and English tests administered in English. There's something new about this attempt to make English the official language of the United States. It's the first time that the Constitution has been used to explicitly take away rights from Americans. Never before in our history, except for a brief period during Prohibition, has the amendment process been used to take away rights. While its supporters bill the English language amendment as a gentle reminder that English is the nation's language, and who can disagree with that? Elevating English to a constitutional status immediately and undeniably brings a host of consequences, what we call the hidden agenda of U.S. English and the English language amendment. Take, for example, Proposition 63 in California. Proposition 63 did four things. It said, first, that it was a constitutional amendment to the California state constitution, that English was a common language of the state, but it went beyond that. It tied the hands of government by saying that the legislature shall pass no laws diminishing the role of English, and it gave government new power, the power to take all steps necessary to preserve and enhance the role of English as a common language. Section D gave standing to anyone in the state of California or doing business in the state of California. to sue the state court, to sue in state court, to enforce whatever it meant by diminishing the role of English or enforcing the preservation and enhancement of English. Unfortunately, the proposition, though it passed by a wide margin, except among Latino voters, was poorly written. For example, there were no exemptions written into the proposition for the police or 911 emergency services provided by the state. The second problem is that the intent of the Proposition 63 is unclear. The intent was relegated to the ballot argument, and in the ballot argument, S.I. Hayakawa and his colleagues stated that Proposition 63 would not apply to public safety and justice where public safety and justice were required. But even there, it's unclear, because S.I. Hayakawa, in his testimony to the State Senate and State Assembly, indicated that the driver's license tests in Spanish and other languages would be permitted, because that was in the public safety. Yet Assemblyman Frank Hill of Whittier, the key legislative supporter of California State Assembly, who is putting together, by the way, a package of bills to enforce Proposition 63, is intent on getting rid of the bilingual driver's license tests. As I mentioned earlier, the court interpreters and the 911 emergency services in California are statutory in nature. They come from the California Governmental Code. The constitutional amendment, of course, takes precedence over the statutes, and the statutory protections for these services can only now be looked at in the context of the constitutional amendment. The only known result is that it will end in litigation. And finally, in the area of the private sector and business, English language supporters contend that it only applies to government. It is only for the public sector. But because government is so pervasive in the private sector, the English language amendment will apply to business. Look at Monterey Park, California. When the city council had before it the resolution to make English the official language, S.I. Hayakawa's statement to the city council made it clear that its purpose was to get rid of the Chinese language business signs. Look at the Pacific Bell Telephone Company, which was subjected to large numbers of letters written at the behest of U.S. English, opposing the company's bilingual phone system. And on to the Philip Morris boycott and the opposition to McDonald's and Burger King for having Spanish language menus, or the housing advertising in Florida. This movement and this law is very much geared to the private sector as well as the public sector. And finally, although we wouldn't expect English language amendment supporters to be responsible for this, the recent Supreme Court decision in Posadas International versus the Tourist Department of Puerto Rico, which for the first time put great restrictions on commercial free speech. It held that the state can regulate the advertising, even ban the advertising, truthful advertising, on legal products. When the Supreme Court extends greater powers to the state on advertising, and when the state and the English language amendment allows greater intra-state powers over language, tying those two together into a mandate saying that the legislature shall take all steps necessary to ensure the role of English is to ensure that the role of English is preserved and enhanced, brings together the power of the English language amendment over the private sector, over business, and advertising activities.
Mr. Moreno, thanks. Appreciate it. Now, thanks to somebody's flight all the way across country, we can look at Monterey Park, and here is Monty Manabag.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first say how pleased I am to be here tonight at Harvard. I thank the Asian, Black, and Latino caucus for inviting us tonight. The issue before us is a significant one, and I'm pleased to present my perspective from the local government standpoint. I think it appropriate, however, to preface my remarks with an overview as to where I'm coming from. First of all, I consider myself as good an American and loving the English language as the best of our fellow citizens, even though I speak some Filipino dialects and Spanish as well. And I say this because during the campaign for Prop 63 in California, some of the proponents try to make you feel unpatriotic and un-American for not supporting it. You are against motherhood and apple pie. This, of course, was sheer nonsense. Just like a good many immigrants, I, too, am happy to be in America, sharing the belief in and commitment to democracy, freedom, and equality of opportunity. I think this is what has brought people to these shores, more so than any one language. I was born in the Philippines and moved to California in the 1950s. I went to the University of the Philippines for a while, and there were some years in between. Spent in Hawaii as a child. In Hawaii, I played with and went to school with Asian, Portuguese, Native Hawaiian, and Anglo kids. And even as we spoke Pidgin English, the language of our childhood, we understood and respected each other's culture and customs. And to me, Hawaii was a true lesson in racial harmony. I took up residence and set up law practice in Monterey Park in 1961 and became politically involved. But to tell you what happened in Monterey Park with official English, I'll have to give you some background about our city. In the 1960s, Monterey Park's population makeup was 80% white, 15% Latino, and 5% Asian. Today it is 48% Asian, 30% Latino, and 25% white. It didn't really matter what the percentages were, because to us, Monterey Park was a microcosm of what America is all about. As the first Filipino-American elected to public office in Southern California, I was delighted that Monterey Park led the way in electing candidates from ethnic groups that have not been too successful in politics in this country. We had Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Latin Americans elected to our city council. And I became mayor even with the Anglo majority at that time. We sent one Korean American, perhaps the only one in the country, to the state senate. And today in the U.S. Congress sits a former colleague on my city council, Marty Martinez. In 1985, we were one of 500 cities nationwide entered in the All-America City Contest. When we appeared before the national jurors in San Antonio, we could not show the kind of grandiose projects that other cities presented. Instead, we showed videos of happy people from different ethnic groups working together on community projects. We talked about our interpreter program by which any non-English speaking person could stop a policeman in the street and immediately be placed in radio contact with somebody who spoke that person's language. We talked about our Asian Police Task Force, which enabled our Asian business people to communicate more freely with our police and to help in fighting crime. We talked about our programs designed to teach English and citizenship to our growing numbers of immigrants, a class I was very happy to teach as a community volunteer. In other words, we emphasized people programs, people helping people. And now that's what won the title for us, by the way. We became the All-America City in 1985. And we were on the map. Monterey Park was acclaimed for its racial harmony, and our residents were euphoric at this whole honor. Now that was short-lived, because following our 1986 municipal election, a funny, if not tragic thing happened in our city that ended all that. The majority of 3 new council members passed an official English resolution. It was done without prior notice to the public, after midnight, and when members of the audience had already gone home. No sooner had the news filtered through the community when the tempest broke. People picketed City Hall with banners denouncing what they perceived as a racist council. Subsequent council meetings were packed with people emotionally pleading with us to rescind the offending measure. A Taiwanese American group filed suit against the city, charging us with racism in our official actions. Verbal and physical encounters took place between proponents and opponents. We are in our council chambers. At one meeting, a pro-English only leader became abusive, and I ordered him removed when he failed to leave the podium after I ruled him out of order. He then battered the police captain that came along to escort him out of the council chambers. Of course, he was subsequently convicted of disrupting the public meeting and for battering a police officer. But this is just one of the ugliness, the ugly results that came out of this whole thing. Now, Monterey Park was again on the map, a second time. Peter Jennings came and interviewed me on his World News Tonight from NBC. ABC and even the British broadcasting networks came to Monterey Park to report the problem. They said Monterey Park was big news now because of our official English resolution and its consequences. Well, suddenly and in one fell swoop, our beautiful all-America city now appeared to be a city of hate, where once friendly neighbors now exchanged racial slurs, and frequent fights erupted in schoolyards along racial lines, where lawsuits were being filed based on charges of racism. And finally, the people called for a recall election, the very first in the history of Monterey Park in 70 years. I was finally able to persuade a colleague, an Italian-American colleague, to change his vote. In switching sides, he publicly announced that he did not realize the consequences and did not intend, when he voted for the measure, to bring about a fracturing of the community as it happened. And so we rescinded the measure on a 3-2 vote. While a semblance of normalcy has returned to Monterey Park, some scars do remain. There's still a lot of bitterness, and the 2 council members who did not change their votes are still up for recall in June. In my 3 terms as councilman and mayor, I have never seen anything that has caused more bitterness and more racial tension than that caused by this seemingly innocuous official English measure. I believe that everyone coming to America would want to learn English, and I agree with Mr. Moreno that without proficiency in English, it's almost impossible to get ahead in this country. So we really ought to support English proficiency programs to assist our citizens to learn the accepted language of this country. English-only legislation leads to discrimination and intergroup conflict. It tends to divide rather than unite us as Americans. I believe this because it happened in my city of Monterey Park, California, USA. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Montabaugh. And now, also fresh from a long flight, I take it, from California, Arnold Torres.
Good evening. I wanted to begin by thanking, everybody always thanks for coming to Harvard. So thank you for inviting me to come to Harvard. I'm sure all of you thank your parents and your own abilities that you came here. Before I begin, I think that this is an important session in the sense that perhaps for the very first time that I've ever been involved in one of these things, we may actually have an actual intelligent discussion, because this debate is never one in which much intelligence ever wins out. It is constantly an extremist perspective, conflict-oriented. The proponents basically do make you feel like you are insulting America if you disagree. Those who disagree believe everybody who believes that English should be the official language is a racist. And oftentimes everybody goes away feeling just about the same way they did before, except maybe a little bit more upset. As I go into my comments, I'm going to try to stick to my topic, which is what does an English-only policy mean to minorities? And before I begin, I want to ask a question. I like to get the crowd participating because I see a couple of you people getting nodding a little bit here. So let's wake you all up. And let me ask, how many of you have read material by the English language movement, U.S. English? raise them higher so I don't want to insult your intelligence. Okay, how many of you have done a little bit of research on the material that they read or that they publish? So you've read more than one piece? Are you all tired, or am I phrasing the question wrong? Okay, I'll just take for granted that you all have read the material then, at least maybe a fifth of the audience. I think it's interesting to when you read the material, it's important to understand the image that is cast by the proponents of making English the official language. I too agree with Mr. Pappas. It is not English only. It is making English the official language. And there is a difference. They don't propose, according to the material, to advocate that only English be the language spoken. They do not disagree that foreign language classes should not be taught. In fact, they say that English language, other foreign languages should be taught. So in all fairness to the English language proponents, Mr. Pappas is right. It is not exclusively English only. Let me read to you some quotes, again, not by a Hispanic advocate, because oftentimes those who are proponents of this movement will try to discredit those of us who are trying to look at it simply from a very, very historical base, factual base. And they will say that we are paid lobbyists, that we're rabble-rousers, that we are paid, and that we're very glib, articulate, English-speaking Hispanic advocates who want to keep our own people down because we want them to only speak Spanish. And to most people on the street, it's a very convincing argument. And it is one that certainly went a great distance in convincing many people in California. So what I'm going to read from you from today, there is not one Hispanic that's written this article. It is all non-Hispanics. They have written history, they are immigrants, and they look like Mr. Loring and Mr. Pappas. They do not look like Arnold Torres or Mario Moreno or Manny Manevog.
I was mistaken for Mr. Moreno when I first entered.
There you go. He's going to be one of us at the end of by the end of the night. Now, let me read to you a passage which, if you close your eyes and just simply use other groups, you can see that it's almost the same. Numerous discussions of language and nation in the early 20th century suggested that without a forceful language policy establishing English as the national language and restricting the teaching of other languages, the United States would be fragmented into linguistic minorities seeking to establish their own separate states. Now, how many of you have read that in the U.S. English material that you've browsed over? Okay, some of you. That's a major argument. It's oftentimes, Quebec is used quite often. In fact, I won't be surprised if Mr. Loring used Quebec as an example of that. Now, a cleavage in the language now would mean to us a cleavage of the nation in its most vulnerable, if not in its most essential part. That no matter what our origin, no real American can desire, for it is not a question whether we are to be part German or part English. We might survive with the national spirit cut in two, but should our German-born citizens be successful in making German co-equal with English in our public schools, the Bohemians who hate the very sound of the German language would demand a similar chance for the Czech tongue, and they know how to fight for what they want. Now, you take Germans out and you put Hispanics in there, or you put the French in there in the case of Canada, and you've got 1986. This was written at the turn of the century, except they were talking about Germans and Czechs, and the following paragraphs about Hungarians, Finns, and Scandinavians. The same contentions that many of the proponents of this movement today make were being made at the turn of the century, 1860s. Nothing very different from what we see happening at all today. But it is very interesting to note that the issue of language is really never the issue. That's never really the major concern. Language becomes the major focus when a group of people who do not speak English or speak a variation of English present a threat to dominant society, whether it be political, economic, or social. In this case, the threat to American society, as viewed by the proponents of the movement, are Spanish-speaking. Now, that doesn't mean that every soul who proposes or who believes in the English movement is a bigot, because they're not. They simply are ignorant of the fact that pushing this effort is not going to bring about one soul who doesn't speak English well to English proficiency. But if that was the concern, this would not be the approach. So language is not the objective. The objective is to somehow manifest, or better yet, is a manifestation of some kind of a fear on the part of many people who propose this. Now, this may not be Mr. Loring or Mr. Pappas's objective. It may not even be their sentiment. Mr. Pappas comes from a bilingual family. You heard it here, right? Some of his best friends are Hispanic. He's gone to Mexico and he studied in Mexico. So obviously, Mr. Pappas does not have a hang-up. He even has Hispanic relatives. So obviously, his hang-up is not Hispanic. So Mr. Pappas cannot be put in that group of people who have a problem with the Spanish speaking. Mr. Pappas and those who believe like Mr. Pappas, unfortunately, are misguided souls who, unfortunately, have not read history of this great country. Because history shows that of all the minority groups in this country that have been the objects, or the targets, better, of this movement, they were in the same situation that many of the Spanish-speaking groups are in today. The numbers are great. They're coming in what U.S. English suggests are unstoppable numbers. They have always been questionable characters. After the Civil War in the 1860s, language became a major issue. People that were coming in were not your traditional type of immigrants, supposedly. Their language, their culture was being questioned as potentially being un-American. And if you read the material by U.S. English, such as this Green Book and these brochures, you begin to see that the paper tiger or the straw man is being very effectively developed by U.S. English. They are, in essence, questioning the Americanism of people who do not speak English well enough. Why? Because they are primarily concerned that people who don't speak English are going to only want to speak their language. None of the statistics prove this. None of the history of the previous groups prove this. But one thing that you can, in all honesty, give credit to this movement, historically, is that it has arrested, it has virtually stagnated the debate of whether this country will be more than monolingual. It must be given credit for being able to accomplish that. It arrests the direction and the suggestion or the idea that this country and its people should speak more than one language. Never that should there be another language that's co-equal. No, just simply that people be bilingual or that they speak more than two languages. 2 minutes more.
2 minutes?
1 minute. 1 minute.
Should we give him the gong? What do we do?
30 seconds.
We'll come back.
We'll just negotiate it. I would only say that I didn't even get to the doggone topic.
Well, you will. Somebody call on him when it's questions.
Yes, I guess we'll handle the questions as best we can.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
And now, I'll make it up to you. And now, State Representative John Loring of Massachusetts.
Maybe since everybody has taken so much time, maybe I just shouldn't say anything. I'm a skunk in the living room anyway here, it seems like, but that's all right. First, I'd like to give you the status of the bill that's in the legislature that I filed, and a little bit of just a very brief history of what happened. I filed the bill first last year with several other co-signers, and the bill was filed by me initially as the original sponsor just because I thought it was a good idea. I didn't have all this dialogue. It just seemed to me that English as the official language of Massachusetts seemed like a pretty good idea. Let's file a bill and see what happens. The dialogue has begun. The dialogue has really built. But what happened was we had the bill before the committee, got a favorable report, got it to the floor of the House, and by voice vote it was passed and engrossed and sent over to the Senate. Of course, then the controversy started to arise. All the opponents started to make noises and you can get to 50 senators a lot easier than you can get to 160 representatives, and the bill just died in the Committee on Steering and Policy in the Senate and went nowhere. I filed it again this year, and we've already had the public hearing on it. It was a very stormy public hearing. All the opponents were there, and unfortunately not many proponents were there. But the bill is not going to get a favorable report this year. The bill is not going to get an unfavorable report. I happen to be on the committee that hears the bill, so I've convinced the rest of the committee members to put the bill into a study, which in effect kills the bill for this year. But at least in a study, it's alive enough to be looked at and to continue this dialogue and to talk about these things that are being alleged that the objectives are of making English the official language. I don't agree. I don't agree, for that matter, with a lot of the alleged attitudes of U.S. English. It's not my objective, and it was not my reasons for filing the bill. But let me just read the very brief statement that I have written up. That was all a preamble to what I'm going to say now. The designation of English as the official language of the Commonwealth is basically a confirmation of what has been fact for the past 200 years of our existence as an independent country. English has been the language of education and commerce since colonial days. However, there's nothing in the Constitution or the general laws where this fact is confirmed. This country has always been a melting pot, welcoming people from all over the world to enjoy the freedom and independence it offers. The system has worked very well over the years, without the designation of an official language. The reason being that people who emigrated to this country, for the most part, were extremely motivated, ambitious, and recognized the need to know the language in order to take advantage of the opportunities open to them. As our country and the dependence on government grew, a wide variety of social programs have developed which recognize the needs of all levels of our society. We have, in my opinion, reduced the motivation that inspires people to learn the language and compete for the fruits of our economy. Some of the greatest success stories in this country come from people of humble beginnings who had a language barrier and also had that great desire to succeed. Their first and most important objective was to learn the language. Our growth and future prosperity can be more secure if we continue to inspire that kind of motivation, not only for the immigrants' well-being, but also as competition for all of us to work harder to succeed. There's no question in my mind that this country will continue to welcome people from other countries, whether they speak the language or not. The passage of this legislation could be just the incentive needed to inspire the adoption of even more generous and effective programs to encourage learning the language in the quickest and most efficient way. The fear that this legislation would curtail or destroy bilingual education programs, I think, is unfounded. This could be a new beginning to the awareness and responsibility on the part of those who make the laws, particularly in liberal Massachusetts, to develop bilingual education programs that really fulfill the needs of people to learn the language. We're not at the present time encouraging English in our bilingual education programs. What we're actually doing is converting our cultures to the language of the participants and teaching English as a secondary function. We must make learning English the first priority. I'm convinced that it will be done if this proposed legislation is ultimately passed. Extremists on both sides of any issue are always ready to resist any change that they perceive as a threat to rights or privileges that they may have been given. They're seldom right, whether they be conservative or liberal in their views. The right answer usually lies somewhere in between. In the long run, I believe we can find that solution. By serving the needs of progress and prosperity in this country, we will also serve the needs of all the people. In closing, I say that we cannot be a country of many different languages where people cannot understand each other and expect to continue to be a great country of freedom and opportunity. We can accommodate and help those who are in need of language training and at the same time make the transition less traumatic. Multi-language license exams will continue to be offered. Bilingual education programs will be improved. As a participant in local and state government for over 30 years, I'm confident that minorities will be served better and more efficiently if we all have a common base from which to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Loring. Now it's time for questions, and while people who want to speak file up to the two microphones left and right, what I'd like to do is pick up on a suggestion made by Mr. Torres and in a way responded to by Mr. Loring and pose a question to Mr. Pappas. Mr. Torres suggested in a way that there is a hidden agenda here, that the overt agenda of U.S. English is not the real agenda, and Mr. Loring's comment that in a way we are now seeing the reduced motivation to compete for the fruits of society suggests that that's part of his overt agenda in Massachusetts. Could you comment in specific about the purposes of the U.S. English language proposal, and comment also on what would be the downside if the proposal were not enacted into law?
It's a little difficult because the question seems so broad. The indictment was all encompassing.
Well, respond to it as you will. But.
Well, I heard that the 1st, 6th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, which was income tax, and other amendments were in danger, and I was a little uncertain what that might have meant. I guess I would like to ask how the First Amendment is endangered by an English-only amendment. It's not clear to me that you can't maintain a Spanish-language press. It's not clear to me that you can't petition the legislature. I mean, you simply would have to get a translator. It's not clear to me how the Sixth Amendment would be somehow denied, or the benefits would be denied a person. We all have court interpreters. If you go to federal court, you bring your interpreter. They appoint you an interpreter. 16th Amendment somewhat befuddles me. The charges were very broad, but there's a lack of specificity. I think there was a statement that English language amendment would somehow diminish bilingual education. I'm not particularly sure the English language amendment even speaks to bilingual education. It doesn't deal with the methodology of bilingual education. If you want to talk about a downside, conceivably, it probably would allow critics of prolonged bilingual education to ask the question, how many years is enough? I don't always read the Boston Globe, but I think they pointed out that in the Boston City school system, the majority of the students were in bilingual programs for more than 6 years. Laval Wilson was somewhat critical of how bilingual education was being administered in Boston. I don't think anyone could say that most people in the Boston City school system are particularly literate in either language, so it's not clear a lot of education is going on there. But I think, and I guess this is the question I would put to the audience, if the objective of bilingual education is to bring about some transition into the English language, is it fair to ask, are 6 years too many? I think if there were an English language amendment, it would be somewhat easier intellectually to ask that question. Are 2 years enough? Are 3 years enough? But maybe at some point, 6 years might not be acceptable. And I think this amendment might encourage that. But once again, when you make mention of so many constitutional amendments and simply state that people's rights will be abridged and not exactly give me specific examples of how that will come about, I'm a little hard-pressed to answer, because my statement is I don't think there are a lot of downsides. I don't believe the 1st, 6th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments are in danger. The mayor spoke of living in Hawaii, which he found a very wonderful experience. My question would be, in the 50s, what was the extent of the multilingual sensitivity in Hawaii? How is he diminished by living in what I assume some might have called an English-only Hawaii? He seems to have done well. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Monterey Park managed to elect people to education. If you want to talk about a downside, conceivably, it probably would allow critics of prolonged bilingual education to ask the question, how many years is enough? I don't always read the Boston Globe, but I think they pointed out that in the Boston City school system, the majority of the students were in bilingual programs for more than 6 years. Laval Wilson was somewhat critical of how bilingual education was being administered in Boston. I don't think anyone could say that most people in the Boston City school system are particularly literate in either language, so it's not clear a lot of education is going on there. But I think, and I guess this is the question I would put to the audience, if the objective of bilingual education is to bring about some transition into the English language, is it fair to ask, are 6 years too many? I think if there were an English language amendment, it would be somewhat easier intellectually to ask that question. Are 2 years enough? Are 3 years enough? But maybe at some point, 6 years might not be acceptable. And I think this amendment might encourage that. But once again, when you make mention of so many constitutional amendments and simply state that people's rights will be abridged and not exactly give me specific examples of how that will come about, I'm a little hard-pressed to answer, because my statement is I don't think there are a lot of downsides. I don't believe the 1st, 6th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments are in danger. The mayor spoke of living in Hawaii, which he found a very wonderful experience. My question would be, in the 50s, what was the extent of the multilingual sensitivity in Hawaii? How is he diminished by living in what I assume some might have called an English-only Hawaii? He seems to have done well. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Monterey Park managed to elect people to various offices from all sorts of ethnic groups. I think this might have been prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act and some of the other legislation that people say is in danger. Well, people seem to have made pretty good progress under, quote, the old regime. Mr. Torres speaks about, well, another question I would ask is, now that Proposition 63 does exist in California, what have people actually suffered in Monterey Park? What has really changed after the conflict, after all of the personal attacks, after all the hatred we've heard about? How did life change in Monterey Park?
Who would like to answer some of Mr. Pappas's questions? Maybe what we should do is go to a question from the audience. Could you identify yourself by your name?
Yeah, my name.
And affiliation, if you... It should be working.
I can hear you.
Okay. My name is Vincent, and I'm a student at college. And my question is addressed to Mr. Pappas and Mr. Orley. I would like to know if you can list for us specific terms, benefits of passage of this amendment, which are not just symbolic, which are substantial. And secondly, if you can give reasons why you believe that passage of this amendment would not have the effect that the law was passed in
Did you do the first part first? No, just refresh my memory, the first question.
The first part is, can you list for us?
Okay, I think I can recall. Dade County was once a bilingual county. It strikes me that without such an amendment, that might more often come about. I mean, there would be the potential to petition that counties, city governments become multilingual. I mean, I'm not really sure when we say bilingual, what we mean. Do we mean Korean in English, or do we mean Lithuanian in English? Is there any limit on the number of languages that would be officially recognized when we become multilingual? As we said, I don't think this is a English-only situation, and I don't think intellectually we're really talking about a bilingual situation only. We're talking about multilinguality. If you were elected to the school board of a city and didn't speak English, could it be compelled that the proceedings be conducted in 2 languages, or that the minutes be reproduced in 2 languages? Is it inconceivable, as Mr. Torres suggested, that some people would suggest, given the fact that I think immigration is a fact of life and will continue unabated, I make a good portion of my living as an immigration lawyer, getting people into the country, so that's my impression of how the world works. Is it inconceivable that we would not have a language act as you have in Canada and all documents should be printed in 2 languages? Or what's the limit? Maybe 3 languages, maybe 4 languages. When it comes to balloting, when is it appropriate to print a ballot in another language other than English? The Voting Rights Act talks about 5% of the relevant population. I'm not sure how you draw the lines. It raises certain questions in my mind. I don't know how you get to be a voting citizen if you are not, in theory, literate in English, because that's one of the grounds almost always of naturalization. It's true my grandmother can't read and write English, but she derived her citizenship in 1918. So I don't know how you get to be 5%, but assuming you did get 5%, and assuming you agreed with the Voting Rights Act that the ballot should be printed in another language, if that is that important, why is it if you have only 3% of the population, you're not entitled to a multilingual ballot or a bilingual ballot? So I see an awful lot of questions opening up, and I see as the demographic changes go on, there's even more potential for litigation, for more ballots, more documents printed in more languages. It strikes me as though it would be chaotic. So I think that is a partial answer, I guess, to the first question. The second question was something about Monterey Park.
The second question is, why do you believe that what Mr. Manabad described to us happened in Monterey Park will not happen on a larger scale if we're meant?
Well, the first question I would have is, what's the situation in Monterey Park now? Now, I understand that a lot of people were very upset, and it was a traumatic period of time, but Proposition 63, in theory, is the law of California with all of the attendant evils that were described by Mr. Moreno. But what is the situation in Monterey Park now? Are we talking about a very brief transition? Are we talking about a period that was highly dynamic? There were a lot of activists. I mean, I'm not too sure what the dynamics were at that time, but Monterey Park is still there. That resolution is now moot. It's the law of California. What services were denied? What rights were denied? How were people's lives diminished? I haven't been told that.
Would one of the panelists like to respond to those questions?
Yes, the question was, can you hear me? What's happening in Monterey Park? It's, as I mentioned earlier, there's still a lot of bitterness and resentment. The 3 members of the council who passed that resolution were elected after a backlash. There was a backlash against the Chinese, essentially, because they came in great numbers from the mid-70s up to today, and that's why the demographics have changed to quite a bit, to 40% from 5% Asian. They were people from Taiwan and Hong Kong who actually brought a lot of capital. They've developed the community. They've spent a lot of money to develop Monterey Park. All the vacant lands are gone. The old buildings went down and new buildings went up. Along with that came a lot of Chinese commercial signs. Along with that, had a lot of traffic congestion, a lot of condominiums being built. And during that election, these candidates who were against all of this talked about all these mini malls and against the condominium complexes, about the traffic and so forth. Now, who were building and buying these condominiums? It was the Chinese. Who was building and buying these mini malls? It was the Chinese. Who was contributing a great deal to the traffic congestion? The Chinese. And of course the Chinese signs. What I'm saying is it was perceived clearly as a racist election, and because of the backlash, because of the way they campaigned, they won. Unfortunately, not enough of the Latino Americans and the Asian Americans went out to vote.
Excuse me?
Not enough of the Latino and the Asian Americans went out to vote in that election. So they ousted 2 Latino council members and 1 Chinese American. Now, of course, they've done other things as well. These 3 members of the council have gone on to deny a Taiwanese American association from building a senior citizens home. They just passed a moratorium which prohibits further building. There's a Asian nursery school there that can't even build a fence to enable to protect the kids from the traffic of the streets, and all these things are perceived as racial in nature. And this is what I'm saying. I'm saying that the resentment, the bitterness is still there, and this is why you have the recall movement going on right now against those three.
My response is that what he's described is not necessarily the result of an English language amendment. I mean, it may be symptomatic of, but I don't think it's the cause of anything. We're still talking about what have people been denied because of an English language amendment. I mean, can you talk to the police? Have you somehow been disenfranchised? Is it true that you can't vote? Has bilingual education been diminished? That I haven't heard. Now, when you have a rapid demographic change like that and you have that sort of violent reaction, we had busing in Boston.
Well, I have
Nothing unusual about that in a society. What does that have to do with an English language amendment?
Excuse me, Mr. Pappas. In response to that, I want to say that, first of all, the Proposition 63 just recently passed. All right. I described in my talk what Proposition 63 did. All right. It established English as the official language of California. It gave power to the, or actually what it did, it tied the hands of government in terms of providing services that would assist recent immigrants in assimilating into the American mainstream. And this is what I mean by that. By having English as the official language passed, and within that proposition also having the ability of anyone living in California or doing business in California, giving them the ability to sue the state for any actions that the state may take to diminish the enhancement of English, in California. That in itself has a chilling effect on government's ability to respond, to immigrants, and that, is what we fear. There are those provisions within Proposition 63 that allow for this. So there are people within California, that are going to be using this tool in order to limit the services that the state provides that are, non-English based, that are, bilingual in nature. The 911, emergency numbers, the translations at hospitals that say, at county hospitals or at state hospitals, the postnatal care type instructions, billing, all of those services that are set up in order to assist, a recent, immigrant group that is trying to assimilate and that have constitutional rights and that should have access to benefits, in this system.
Okay. May I interject? A lot of that it seems to me, is really scare tactics. I mean, it's the kind of approach that said, like, we changed the Constitution in Massachusetts to allow the death penalty, but we'll never have a death penalty until the legislature passes it. California passed a proposition to change the Constitution to allow for English as the official language. But it'll never be the official language until the California legislature makes it the official language by the structure of constitutional government. So, I've heard so many times in any one of these kind of controversial issues, the scare tactics. Proposition 2.5 was going to destroy Massachusetts. There'd be no more schools, no more public safety, no more anything, because we're going to cut the taxes by 2.5% a year. It didn't happen. Yes, we had some struggles. Yes, we had to do some real soul-searching and management adjustments, and adjusted to Proposition 2.5. I think the same kind of thing can happen with I'm not proposing a constitutional change in Massachusetts in the first place. I'd like to see us pass a law and say English is the official language, and then the legislature has to put it together properly to be functional.
A quick comment from Mr. Torres, and then we'll go to the gentleman on the left.
You ask the fundamental question which many people in California forgot to ask, and certainly as you've witnessed, Mr. Pappas and Mr. Loring haven't answered. And nobody answers it from the proponent's perspective. But you hear the contentious, extreme arguments. Service is going to be cut? No, that's not true. That's scare tactics. And that's where the debate always stays in. The fact of the matter is that even beyond the issue of services being cut, what do you do to American society? What do you do to the fabric of it? And what you do is, I'm not concerned about telling Mr. Pappas that there's one Hispanic or one Asian woman who doesn't have service. That's going to happen one way or another for some other reasons. The point is that those people, Hispanics, Asians, and Anglo-Americans, don't understand each other any better than they did 6 months ago or 8 months ago. And at a time in California society, and more importantly, at a time in United States history, when we are going through a second Statue of Liberty phase in this country, except now the people are coming from the third world, okay, the last thing that we need is to repeat history. And I've got a passage here about what happened in Boston, school superintendents during 1910. Mr. Lauren, I'm sure you're a native Massachusetts. I'm surprised you haven't read that.
I wasn't here in 1910, though.
Mr. Loring, I think you may be just a couple of years older than me, and I've read the history. It's not history that my people wrote, Mr. Loring. This is history that's American history that we all should read, those of us who are born in this country, and those of us that are coming to this country, in order to understand what's happened before, in order to learn from the past so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. And what we're seeing right now is simply a constant repetition. Your question is fundamental. Mr. Loring will not answer that today. He won't answer it tomorrow. He hasn't even told us why he introduced it, but he did make an extremely important distinction. You noticed in his prepared comments, he said that the people at the turn of the century, immigrants before, came and they learned English. You notice he didn't make that contention. He didn't say that about today's immigrants. See, right there, very fine distinction. Nothing nasty about Mr. Loring, but it is a very fine distinction.
Well, it's a fine distinction because it's a very different society now.
But
there are less incentives
you have
to
said,
learn.
but what are the incentives now, Mr. Loring? Let's get to the specifics. What incentives are you saying now that make today's immigrants any different from those at the turn of the century that are going to lead Spanish-speaking people and Asian people to speak only their language and refuse to speak English?
Well, I think
what documented evidence do you have that can substantiate that contention clearly?
Well, I don't have documented evidence to support it.
Wait. Could the audience get a word in
Yes,
edgewise?
I think. I think the gentleman's been very patient. We'll ask you to respond very shortly. Thank you for your patience.
I had several points. I wanted to speak as one of those glib English-speaking Hispanics, proudly. My name is Camilo Perez. I'm an attorney. I work with the national organization that's called META, Multicultural Education, Training, and Advocacy. In that job, I've traveled to 22 states throughout this country, representing language minority parents, particularly Latino parents, also Filipino, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Cambodian, Haitian, and others, Portuguese, more close to home. I have never met a bilingual parent who did not want their child to learn English and to learn it well and to learn it quickly and to learn it effectively in order to participate in this society. Never in 22 states. I represent a statewide coalition of bilingual parents, Hispanic bilingual parents throughout the state of Massachusetts. This is the second time in about 3 weeks I get to address Mr. Loring. I was there on March 4th when this bill came before the State Administration Committee. I have never met a single Hispanic, Vietnamese, Haitian, Cambodian, or other language minority parent in any city in the state of Massachusetts. No, let me just, I'm getting there. Just wanted to lay the basis in terms of documentation. I have some. And, we can talk about that later in terms of Mr. Loring's bill. My question, I think, was why it is that Mr. Pappas found it necessary to make at least 4 egregious factual errors in the course of his presentation. First of all, the 16th Amendment never came up. The reference was to the 15th Amendment. That's one point. The 15th Amendment has to do with a minor scrap around involuntary servitude during the 1860s.
You're confident
you might
didn't
recall.
say 16th?
First. Second, Mr. Pappas mentioned that supposedly over 50% of the bilingual students in Boston were in the program for 6 years or more. In fact, and I was at a meeting with Laval Wilson this afternoon at around 4 o'clock, and you can check with him if you'd like, the figure is 12 to 15%. Second point. Third point, there was references both by Mr. Pappas and by others on this panel to supposed international experiences that were considered to be parallel to the experience in this country. I think the point that Mr. Manibog made is really the most powerful point made tonight about what the impact is of this English-only movement when it comes home. The point was that what happened in Monterey Park is beginning to happen all over this country. It happened in Massachusetts this month, thanks to Representative Loring and Senator Doris. what happened.
Do you have a question?
Yes. The question is, what does Mr. Pappas in fact know, or Mr. Loring, or anyone else who would support these amendments, about the fact that in Sri Lanka, among the Tamils, in Canada, among the Quebecois, in France, among the Bretons, in Spain, among the Catalan and Basque, exactly what led to divisiveness in those societies was movements like U.S. English that started using language as a club, as a substitute for national identity. Do they know anything about those experiences? Clearly they don't, because they were
I
just
think he
using
should.
them tonight.
I think he should answer. Are you answering for? Did you answer that question, or do you want him to answer it?
Well, I don't think that they have one, but I'd like to hear their try.
Well, let's give him a chance.
Yeah.
Well, here we go again. I do believe he mentioned the 16th Amendment. He may have been mistaken in saying it, but he did. Bilingual administrators may have quite a different interest than parents who would like their children to learn English quickly. So I don't think it's relevant to say that 98% of all parents who do not speak English are eager to have their children learn English. It's not clear that they are the dominant players in this. It's conceivable that the bilingual teachers and administrators are the dominant players. What was the second question?
The second question I think he answered, but it is, are you aware of the international histories of divisive language minority situations?
Was that the Tamils in Ceylon? Or?
Well, let's not get
Sri Lanka is the name of the country, but
Well, I'm an old
it shows how much
colonialist.
you know.
That's right. I say Rhodesia also.
I think you're a new colonialist, actually.
In any event, I would think the only relevant example that you're really making is the case of Puerto Rico. Now, what would happen if Puerto Rico were to become a state? Now, that would become relevant in the Quebecois context, I suspect. I don't know. I think that's a tough question. It's conceivable that if Puerto Rico petitioned for statehood, there would have to be some acceptance of English as the official language. Talking about Sri Lanka and people who came from Dravidians who came from southern India and moved into a Buddhist culture doesn't strike me as relevant. They were brought by the British. The Quebecois, as I recall, Jacques Cartier went down the St. Lawrence River in 1534, and Champlain founded Quebec in 1607. And finally, in 1760, the British overwhelmed the French, and there was a huge French population there. So I think that was a form of imperialism. What was the next group we were talking about?
The other question I had was about your misuse of the Voting Rights Act standard of 5%.
Well, that's a new question. You didn't mention it, but let's talk about that.
That was another very important factual mistake that you made.
What is the mistake?
You had a question, Mr. Pappas, about how it could ever be that there would be 5%.
Fine.
Clearly, I mean, I'm glad that you noticed that you stated that you were an immigration attorney, because clearly you're not a civil rights attorney. If you were, you would know that Puerto Ricans living on the continental United States have the right, because of the status of Puerto Rico, the peculiar colonial status of Puerto Rico within this country,
we recognize
to vote
that.
in Spanish.
Do you believe?
You didn't mention that.
Do you believe? I still want to ask the question. Do you believe that in San Francisco that the Spanish ballot is the result of Puerto Ricans who have massively migrated to the Bay Area?
You'd be surprised to know that there are 50,000 Puerto Ricans in the Bay Area.
And that would trigger the 5%.
I'm just saying that's one of the elements that you neglected to mention in your presentation.
Is it true that you need to speak English to be naturalized?
Has anybody ever said on the side of bilingual advocates that it's not? I've never heard
I
it.
only raised the question, how does it come about that you can get a 5% figure in a voting district?
I tell you, it's real easy in Brooklyn, Spanish Harlem,
Well,
Boston, and
therefore,
other
all
places.
these people are Puerto Rican.
I'm saying that's among the groups that you didn't mention, and I think that's an important group that needs to be recognized.
Well,
in this
I have to
discussion as
confess
well.
my ignorance about this fact.
And on many other matters.
Can I answer another part of his question? The question about you never met anybody of several different nationalities parents who weren't anxious and wanted their children to learn English. And nobody seems to want to listen. And this happens to be my point of view, my attitude, my feeling about government, that English as the official language would be a force in government to do just the kind of things that you want to do. What you really want to do for more bilingual education is throw more money at it and accept the fact that whatever we're doing now is right and it can be done better with more money. Well, I say everything we're doing now is not perfect. And everything we're doing now can be improved, and it can be improved by systems, and it can be improved by procedures as much as money. Everything's going to need money, but not just throw money to improve the bilingual education program. I think a law on the books that says English is the official language would be an incentive for legislatures to pass laws that say, hey, we have to take care of the minorities because you will always be out there telling us we have to, and we do.
Thank you. We have a gentleman who's been even more patient over on this side. Sir, the program is still on. Please.
My name is Reverend Vernon Carter. I'm Director of Boston Lutheran Advocacy for Community Change. And I'm always afraid of monolithic connotations because it's been practiced. I represent two cultures, the Black American and the Native American, from each side of my families. And I've seen this monolithic emphasis annihilate the original Americans and keep the blacks in servitude. There's a strange kind of racism that's taking place today. And I'm not going to blame it on a special administration. Well, maybe I will. And this is Ronald Reagan.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Because
Ronald Reagan has the greatest way of dealing with racism without saying black, white, Hispanic, or anything. He does it skillfully. This is one of them. And what happens in Ethiopia, you had Amharic, was dictated by Haile Selassie to make that the general language for Ethiopia. And Ethiopia had a civil war and it's been going on for a long time. Show me where you can avoid.
could we have your question, please, because we're running out of time and other people are waiting.
You didn't give me very much time. Show me where this could not develop within the United States with an official English language. Would it not cause civil strife in the long run? And if it doesn't do this, or if you feel it won't happen, how can you back up your point on this matter?
We're going to do Ethiopia now. Okay. I would argue that Ethiopia was not a nation. It was something of an empire. The Amharas in the highlands managed to control the Eritreans, the Somalians, the people in the Ogaden, and whatever else. So we're not talking about a nation-state, and language is not the cause of this civil war. However, I would argue that conversely, that if we don't maintain a national language, which seems a bit far-fetched, you could very well create factions who would be very much antagonistic to one another. I don't see any parallel between a non-nation state on the Horn of Africa and the United States. I don't think whatever happened in Ethiopia is a result of language.
And how come the monolithic emphasis has caused black people to be in servitude from the time they were in slavery to this present day, and it was a one-way emphasis in the South, and it's a one-way emphasis in the North, and it actually was used as a tool of...
Thank you. I think we take your point, and I think your question was well put, but this woman is waiting. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mary Lynn Kramer, and I've taught ESL for 15 years, and 5 of those years at Harvard and at the Kennedy School. Oh, thank you for letting me speak. I'd like to make 2 comments, and quickly, and then the question. Promise. One, while I was over in Widener Basement, I stumbled across some documentation, which happened to be congressional hearings from during the time of the First World War. And in these hearings, it was stated that this country at the turn of the century, the majority of the people did not speak English. That the majority of the schools in the North taught in German as the first language, that the majority of the schools in the South taught in French as the first language, that there was a great fear that this was going to add to an unpatriotic attitude, that it was very un-American during time of war and strife. That these schools should not be supported, they should not be funded, that 500 newspapers sold on the stands in Boston were 500 different languages, that this should not be supported, that workers in factories should be required to learn English and go to Americanization classes or they would lose their jobs. All these things somehow did in fact take place, so that English went from being not the language of the majority to being the language of the majority, and those schools and those jobs don't exist. The other point is that also by doing some research, I was very impressed by all of the studies on bilingualism related not to how fast you can learn a language, but the necessity of one to continue to grow and think and create in the language that they were learning in, that learning a second language or learning English is important, but that you really cut off a person's intellectual and creative ability, plus the diversity and talents of people who are bilingual and bicultural. Okay? My question is, I feel, as a United States citizen, that I have really been cheated out of a multicultural, multilingual society wherein that kind of creativity and intelligence was denied me. And I'd like to know why. I'd like to know why. I would like to know if you share my suspicions, basically Mr. Torres and Mr. Monabog, anyone else that wants to answer, that it is personal fear and insecurity fed by economic and political fears that are being exploited, and that's why I lost my cultural chance for a broader experience. What do you think it is? Why am I being denied that?
The question was directed to Mr. Torres and Mr. Monabog. Mr. Torres?
I think that was a statement that I made at the beginning, that historically always the reason why we bring in the language movement is because of the fear of a foreign element, supposedly, that threatens the dominant society politically, socially, or economically. When there was been discrimination against ethnic minority groups in this country, against the Japanese, against the Mexican American, against the Puerto Rican, against the Hawaiian, it has always been for political, social, or economic purposes. Primarily, it's been economic in most cases. Now, I think it's very much the social, but also you have to understand the history of America. It got its language history from England, and England basically has always spoke English. It never mandated it. It never passed a law. Wales had a difficulty with it. Other parts of the United Kingdom had difficulty, but they basically felt that if you don't encourage or mandate it, it will simply flourish. And that has always been the way it's been done. It's monolingual society. This society has always been monolingual, and it will remain monolingual. It will never be multilingual, as Mr. Pappas contends or Mr. Loring believes. Certainly, if it can't be multilingual, it's certainly not going to be bilingual. There's just a very strong, rooted history in American society that will stop that from happening. The other difficulty is that in the 60s and the 70s, as we've seen, the courts do not reflect, history does not reflect that the courts stop, in fact, dictate, repress language diversity. It's been society that represses language diversity. That may change in the 1986 for reasons of additional paranoia. We have two generations that are more paranoid now than they were at the turn of the century. But I think you're looking at just simply history, very deep-rooted American history that simply says we are monolingual, we will always remain monolingual. Anybody who speaks two languages, we have to be suspect of that because they may, in fact, want that second language to be an official language. And that's what we're seeing today, is simply a manifestation of that deep-rooted history.
Mr. Monabog, do you?
Yes, you raised the question as to why this issue has caused some feelings of insecurity, and that probably answers a portion of Mr. Pappas' question as to what has happened in Monterey Park. Well, how has this proposition in Monterey Park caused any problems? What's to take it away? Well, precisely this. Because of the large immigrant population of Monterey Park, there is a lot of insecurity among these people now. They speak in hushed tones, afraid of arrest. This is incorrect, of course, but they're fearful of speaking a foreign tongue. They've taken away the one page of our community newsletter, which was written in Chinese, to describe to the Chinese residents the services that we have. So there's a lot of fear, insecurity in Monterey Park because of this.
Thank you. Is there another question on this side? Thank you.
My name is Elisa Fernandez, and I have a question which explicitly brings up statements brought up by Mr. Torres, Mr. Manibag, and Mr. Moreno. And that is a question of whether are not, given that the fact that all sides concede that English does exist in our society and that we should maintain it, why there is a need to change it from de jure to de facto, or the other way around, actually. And secondly, that brings us to, especially to Mr. Loring, that your responsibility as a legislator is not only to recognize what your own personal objectives may be, which are good, but what about the consequences of enacting such a law, the social consequences, in the sense that no one, either Mr. Loring or Mr. Pappas, has addressed directly and which have been brought up by Mr. Manabach?
I think that's why I think this kind of debate is good, and that's why I am not objecting to the bill going into study and not passing this year. I think there's a lot of debate that still has to take place. I think there is a common ground. I think there is a way to improve the economics or the living standards or whatever of people who come to this country and can't speak the language. I think we can do better with bilingual education.
Okay, what I'm asking you is, given that the law that you are proposing, to look at the social ramifications of that law.
That's exactly what I'm doing, is looking at the social ramifications.
But no,
and
you're
saying,
denying the social and racial cleavages that it causes. We are all speaking English. I speak Spanish, but I am speaking English to you. And you are ignoring the social ramifications of enforcing me and saying that I have to speak English and that I cannot speak Spanish.
Let's let him answer the question, and then we'll take one more question.
That certainly is not my intention, to force anyone to have to speak English.
I'm not saying it's your intention. What is the consequence of your intentions? Look at the consequences.
How would this amendment compel you to speak English?
It is in the indirect measures that have been brought up that already bilingual education has been cut, which has not been addressed.
That may be a budgetary issue.
No, the question is, yes, the law may exist, but how do people interpret that law? How does it cause society to interpret that law? Maybe you're saying my intention is not for this to happen, but as Mr. Manabach has said, it does happen and it is happening.
Well, I have to just disagree with you. I said if the law were to pass, I suspect critics of prolonged bilingual education would have some intellectual sustenance to draw upon. The debate about the methodology on bilingual education is not what we're here to discuss. Okay. This amendment is not addressing that issue.
One more question from the gentleman in the red shirt.
I'm Raul Perez. I'm a freshman at the college, and I'm also come from a home that spoke predominantly Spanish, and I'm also a product of bilingual education, so if I can pat myself on my shoulder, not bad, huh, Mr. Loring? But Mr. Pappas, Mr. Loring, you deem it imperative to declare English as official national language in order to preserve this national cohesion. Therefore, my question is twofold. What leads you to believe that having English as official language will indeed preserve it? In other words, how could a procedural law without no substance preserve this deteriorating national cohesion? And two, my other question is for Mr. Torres, Mr. Nguyen. Mr. Could you help me understand what they mean when they state national cohesion? Are they trying to tell me that there's one national culture? I don't understand. I thought there was no national cohesion. I thought we were a melting pot. So, Mr. Pappas, Mr. Loring, please help me understand.
May I?
Please.
First, I'd like to say you characterize me as deeming it imperative to pass this legislation. I don't deem it imperative to pass this legislation. I think that with discussion and debate and dialogue and compromise and understanding of each of our problems.
Excuse me for my semantics, but could you answer the question about the national cohesion?
I can't answer that question.
Mr. Pappas, you're the one who stated it, then can you please answer?
A national cohesion?
Yes.
You want me to do the national culture aspect of it? Or
you stated that it's necessary to preserve the national cohesion. It's all over your literature if you want me to produce a document.
Well, I would suspect, as you said, I'll use your own words, what makes us presume we have a national culture? I presume we do have a national culture.
And what is it?
think it's very much predicated on the language. It's very much predicated on being able to read the Constitution. It's very much predicated on having understanding of the laws. It's very much predicated on having understanding of representative government. And I think the way you convey these concepts generally is through English. Now, you're not suggesting that we create a parallel culture, are you?
No, I'm just trying to understand you.
I come from a bilingual background. Mm-hmm. I do not feel to respond to the woman from the ESL that I've been deprived of anything.
So when you grew up, there was national cohesion, and I am led to believe that in the 80s, in 1987, there's still national cohesion, and I believe in the year 2000 there's going to be national cohesion.
I suspect it depends on how strong you push the language issue.
Don't you think your emphasis should be on English proficiency programs instead of this just procedural reform if you really want to produce an English proficient society?
How many years of bilingual would be too many?
I had 6 years of it. And
did you need 6?
Yeah, because when I went into this Anglo classroom, I couldn't understand English at all.
But why did you need 6? Why did you need 6? How old were you?
That's the way the program was established.
You didn't want him to go to Cornell, did you?
No.
My partner, why did you need 6 years?
Why did I need 6 years? Yeah. It worked. I'm at Harvard. Gee.
If you didn't, are you suggesting that but for?
Pardon?
Are you suggesting that but for 6 years of bilingual education you wouldn't have gotten into Harvard?
That's just worked out. I think your question is kind of irrelevant. What are you trying to get at?
All of my relatives, all right, did not have the benefit of this, and it doesn't seem to have affected their English competence. So I don't know why you need 6 years of bilingual education.
Mr. Thomas?
Did you ask a question? Yeah, I just wanted to comment real quickly. My opening comment was that you have extreme arguments. You've heard it today, except that it's degenerated to the details as to how many years should be bilingual at 4, 3, 2, 6. You really have not heard much from the proponents that say that the ELA is going to have more people speak English. They've not once even substantiated that contention. Mr. Lawrence says that if you pass it, it'll give great impetus to the members of the legislature to do it. The fact that there are 23 million Americans who are functionally illiterate in America, you don't need ELA to say we need to pass classes or literacy programs or English language classes. See, the reason to do all these things is already there. That's why there's much more behind this. And again, it's very interesting. I made some very clear statements in the beginning about history, and it's repeating itself, and I made some passages. And if you could watch yourself on this program, you'll see that the debate simply just went around again. We went over the same issues repeatedly. We're not going to get out of this thing understanding this issue any better. Mr. Pappas never answered any question directly, never answered a fundamental issue. But continues to make his contentions.
Please ask the question again. The fundamental question.
You haven't done it all day. You haven't done it all day, Mr. Pappas. I don't think you're going to do it now. We can do it later.
Between 1920 and 1980?
Mr. Pappas,
Mr. Pappas, I think the fundamental question is
I think my point is
the programs to have an English proficient society.
My point's very simple. I just think very simply that.
I got the gong.
Yeah, I just think very simply that these types of debates sometimes can be helpful, but they always inevitably will degenerate to an extreme argument of conflict, and very seldom do we ever actually get to understand why ELA is really necessary today, as opposed to English classes. If we really want people to learn, let's teach them.
Mr. Moreno, you've been graciously waiting a turn. One last remark, and then we'll close this. I appreciate
and that is, I wanted to touch on something that Mr. Pappas said earlier with regards to the movement English language amendment. There is no threat. Okay, there is no bill before Congress, before any state, to try to make Spanish, the official language of the United States. There's no threat at all. In fact, what we're trying to do is to get more money for English proficiency, within Hispanics, Asians in this country. It seems to me, what occurs to me is that U.S. English has lost their faith in the strength and endurance of the English language. It has endured, these 200 years, and it's going to continue. I agree fully with what Mr. Torres said. I think a more positive way of addressing the problem would be through education. Okay, That is what we're advocating. We're pushing for the English Proficiency Act of 1987 that was introduced by Congressman Martinez and Senator Bingaman. And we're pushing for English Proficiency Acts in a number of states, including New York and Arizona, California. We want desperately to assimilate as quickly as possible, and I'm speaking from the Hispanic perspective. But I'm sure other ethnic groups are as eager to do that because they realize that without English, you are not going to make it in this country. And I agree with the comment that was made by one of the speakers here with regards to his, the mothers of Hispanics wanting their children, to assimilate as quickly as possible, because that's what my mother wanted me to do.
Mr. Moreno, thank you very much. They're going to cut off my head after the end of this. Thanks to all of you, and thanks especially to the panelists. This is a very contentious subject. They have spoken well, each from his own perspective. It's something about which, as one old-timey Harvard faculty member once said, you really have to dig around the roots of your beliefs to figure out where you are. And I thank you all for listening to us and sharing this with us. Anyone who has further questions, there will be a reception, I'm told, sponsored by the Institute for Politics in the lounge over there to your right. So thank you all very much.